Can the soul actually be broken? We talk about broken hearts, broken relationships, broken homes. But what about the soul? And if a soul can be broken, then how does that look like? Welcome to the Architecture of Ascension, the journey of understanding our original design and why understanding precedes actual transformation. So in today's episode, we go through the brokenness of the soul, that is the brokenness of the mind, will and emotions, and how this shows up. Because if we are to faithfully steward our purpose, then we first need to understand who we are and where we are at this journey of understanding the mechanism of our soul. Now, in the book of Psalm 23, verse 3, verse 3 says that He restores our soul. Now, that word restores then suggests that the soul can be broken, the soul can be misaligned, and that brings now the essence of the restoration of our soul. Being broken doesn't mean that we are defective, really. It simply means that our minds, our wills, and our emotions have been misaligned, have been broken by a broken life. It simply means that something within us has been broken by us experiencing life in a broken world. Remember, we say that our soul determines how we think, how we feel, and how we choose by virtue of this being the mind, the will, and the soul. So when our soul is broken, then it affects how we interpret our life. It affects how we experience our emotions and how we make our decisions. Now, what really brings about this brokenness of the soul? One way to understand our woundedness is by understanding the different levels of human need. And for the purpose of this series, I would want us to do a study of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs to understand what the human being naturally tries to secure. So on the first level, under the Maslow's hierarchy, is the physiological needs. And this is our need for food, for shelter, and clothing. And when we face a constant lack in the physiological needs, then our body naturally enters a state of survival. When our mind is focused on survival, then our emotions become more reactive and our will becomes preoccupied with meeting our immediate physical needs. And when our survival mode dominates long enough, then we lack the internal capacity to hold anything else rather than our basic survival. Sitting very closely to our physiological needs is our need for safety. Now, as human beings, we naturally want to feel safe and secure, whether physically or emotionally. Now, when we constantly face abuse, instability, constant uncertainty, betrayal, violence, then our internal system naturally learns that the world is not a safe space. And our mind becomes hypervigilant and our emotions become overwhelmed by feelings of constant fear and anxiety. And our will naturally adapt a pattern of excessive control or avoidance or withdrawal, and now this becomes your pattern of living. And then comes number 3, that is our need for belonging. We are naturally relational beings. We want to be accepted, we want to have meaningful connections, we want to have love, we want to have meaningful relationships around us. Now, when we consistently face relational loss, rejection, abandonment, or isolation, then we begin to form conclusions about our sense of belonging. So in this state, our minds will tell us that we don't belong, and we find our emotions carrying a lot of anxiety and shame, and this will manifest in our relations as a constant need to people please, or constant avoidance or withdrawal altogether. All in a sense, our soul is trying to protect us from being broken from being abandoned. You know, the desire to feel accepted can be so strong that we end up abandoning parts of ourselves just to feel accepted, or withdrawing altogether so that we don't have to face the possibility of being rejected. And then comes our fourth need, that is our need for esteem, our need to experience worth, a sense of value, a sense of competence, and a sense of dignity. Now, when we experience a constant criticism or humiliation or constant comparison or constant failure, then we risk our mind recording all this as I am not enough. You begin to feel inadequate, and your emotions carry a lot of shame and insecurity. Now, in this state of inadequacy, then our soul naturally responds by constantly trying to prove its worth, by overperforming, overachieving, or a constant need of control. And so you find you become so preoccupied by the constantly trying to prove that you're enough, that you lose the ability to simply just be. And then finally, we have the fifth level of need, and that is self-actualization. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine some months back, and she was expressing with concern that this Maslow's hierarchy of needs seems to be a fallacy because we never quite reach the state of actualization. But the truth is, this is where the conversations of purpose begin. This is where the conversations of alignment lead us to purpose. So you find that many times people don't struggle because they lack ability, really. We struggle because we spend so much of our time and energy moving through life, surviving moving through states of survival, that we don't really take time to develop our capacities to who we are truly meant to be, to develop our capacities to live our full potential or to realize our purpose. That is why you find so many people think that it's practically impossible to reach the level of self-actualization. You know, you might have the gifts, you may have the callings and skills and all that, but when you're in a constant state of surviving, then it's very hard for your soul to ascend to that level of self-actualization, to that level where you're now living your purpose. You're now actually living your calling or your dream, if that's what we call it. And so we find that in the state of a broken soul, the broken mind, instead of it will always look at life from the lens of what happened to it. So instead of looking for truth, instead of asking for what is true, it will always scan for what it needs to believe to make you remain safe. And so rejection becomes nobody wants me, and failure becomes I'm not capable, and betrayal becomes nobody can be trusted. And eventually these thoughts become our limiting beliefs. Now, the mind is not trying to process life anymore. It's simply trying to protect us at this level of survival, at this level of brokenness. And then we have our will. Our will carries our capacity to choose, but in a broken soul, our will is then governed by the constant need to self-protect. In this state, the will simply say, I will not try again. I will not trust anyone anymore. I'll stay where it's safe. And this ends up looking something like avoidance or passivity or perfectionism or control, or simply just not moving at all. Like, you know what you should do, but there's something within you that keeps pulling you back. And then comes broken emotions. Emotions are not a bad thing. Actually, our emotions are what allow us to experience love and peace and happiness and joy, and compassion. But in a state of brokenness, in a state of a wounded soul, then our emotions experience anger and grief and resentment and unforgiveness and a constant state of anxiety, worry, fear. And when these dark emotions become overwhelming, then they begin to influence how we think or how we choose. And then the cycle begins. What happened, what I believed, what I felt, what I chose. And when this cycle repeats long enough, then it becomes a pattern. And eventually we end up saying, this is just who I am. But what if what you think you are, or who you think you are, is just a version of you that had to learn to survive? And this is where the story becomes interesting, because a broken soul eventually learns to draw back. So in our next episode, we'll be looking at the drawing back of the soul, and then after that, we'll look at a restored soul. The whole purpose of understanding brokenness is so we will understand what needs to be restored for us to be aligned back to our original design. See you in our next episode.